So it's time for another sowing and growing video, and this one covers the period August and September, probably the most critical period of sowing in the whole year. Times are pretty important at this time of year, but not so important for me or you if you grow under cover. So in cold frames, low tunnels and high tunnels, you got a little bit more leeway than you have if you're just growing outside. I can't cover every permutation and combination of those. I cover more of that in my ebook, but this is what I'm doing, and I'll try and explain where I'm planting things so that you get an idea as to whether I'm doing it just in the open ground, a cold frame, low tunnel or high tunnel. So July has already been a very busy sowing month. I've taken 2 sets of seedlings off this rack behind me. I've got another one on the go at the moment, and most of that has been planted out now. It's been a busy sowing and planting month. Let's look at August. So I start off with lamb's lettuce. Lamb's lettuce is one of those things that I do grow outside, and it grows outside without any real protection. We've only really had 1 year where we had bad losses, and that was extreme cold combined with high winds. And even then, it did recover eventually. It's really hardy. There is a bit of cleanup required of the leaves. You know, you don't get perfect quality, so it can be a bit time consuming to harvest, but it is still a great one. Not actually that great under cover. It really likes to be out in the fresh air. First sowing of radishes for, post the summer hiatus. We don't grow radishes in summer. I find they're just too spicy. They grow too fast. They're often too woody. We just have a break from them. We have them for the rest of the year. So yeah, I'll start a batch beginning of August. Probably start eating that in September. Guardsman is my favoured salad onion. I do use White Lisbon as well, and Leela and North Holland Blood Red, actually lots of different types of salad onions. But if I were to just choose one, it would be Guardsman at this time of year. In the past, I've found that the purple spring onions, which I love, Leela, North Holland Blood Red, they don't do so well over winter. But a friend of mine who actually grows the seeds tells me that he manages to do them just fine. So I'm not quite sure whether I just had a bad batch 1 year and it just put me off. I don't know. I'm going to try them again this year. I probably haven't updated my sowing log yet to reflect that. And then my last sowing of spring cabbage, which will be April. And we have a spring cabbage for the loose leaves as well as the hearts. The loose leaves are a lot healthier, of course, than the hearts. And a lot easier to grow as well. Often a lot of spring cabbages do go to seed. They'll of course be outside as well. And salad rocket, so it's a good addition to their salad mixes, about the middle of August for that. As also Tokyo cross turnips. I'm also doing snowball turnips. I've got a tray actually of them just behind me at the moment. The turnips are one of those things that by the end of August, really, it's hard to get them to mature to good size. I've done it from about the middle of September in the polytunnel, but they do take up a lot of polytunnel space for a very long time. I don't think they're really worth it in the polytunnel. So I just generally interplant them into my brassica beds. So next up is Tough Ball. This is my first sowing of Tough Ball, middle of August. A little bit later than the seed supplier recommends, but that is because of the problems that we're having with mild winters and mild springs last few years, and the result is a lot of them going to seed. So I'm starting, this is my first batch. I'll do some later batches as well in the hope that at least one of those batches goes all the way through. First sign of them starting to go to seed, and we just harvest them and eat them fresh at that time, even if they're just spring onions. So I don't mind having a few batches. They never go to waste. Miner's lettuce. This is another fantastic outdoor crop. Very prolific, extremely healthy as well, and yeah, I really love it. It's one of my all-time favourites over winter. It just like let's go back, lamb's lettuce. It's a little bit fiddly to harvest, and there's quite a lot of cleanup required. So it's one of those things, you know, you wouldn't want it to be your staple salad crop all through winter, but it's nice as a sort of addition, and it's one of those few things, as I say, that you can grow outside. We're actually going to grow quite a nice patch of it in the polytunnel, just because, you know, I think the cleanup will be a little bit quicker and easier in the polytunnel than the stuff growing outside. Then I've got a nice batch of Asian greens, probably more actually than I've got shown on here, but I just go through my seed packets and just sow, you know, a mix of Asian greens of all different types. But we'll definitely be sowing red pak choi, Joy choy, and tatsoi. Tatsoi is my favourite for salads. The other two are good for cooking. And they'll go in probably one of my cold frames, and they'll do pretty well in there until about January time, and then I find that they pretty much give up. So I will do another batch in September, which will go into polytunnel. They should go for a little bit longer into winter. And more spring onions, loads and loads of spring onions, and I do multiple successions of spring onions all the way through August and into September, because I don't want them to all come at the same time, and because we'll be eating these spring onions all the way through, well, actually pretty much every week of the year, not just this sowing, of course, then yeah, I just want multiple successions. But by about early September, I'm finishing with the spring onions, because they really don't grow much after that. And then my first sowing of true spinach. In winter, we really like giant winter. And if you were just doing giant winter outside, I wouldn't really start it much later than the middle of August. But when you're doing it in cold frames in particular, you can start it all the way through until the middle of September and still get a really good harvest over winter. I like that kind of successional sowing of it as well, because otherwise I just get a huge glut of it in autumn, and I don't like huge gluts. So I like the successions to gradually build in terms of coming on stream for harvest, so that I'm getting all of the beds harvest ready in December, which is when growth slows down to a minimum. So yeah, so you'll see multiple successions of giant winter as we go along. And then a batch of lettuce. This one will just go in a cold frame, and it won't see out the winter. All the lettuces that I'm going to be harvesting in winter are going to be in the polytunnel. I find the polytunnel is just a vastly superior environment for growing lettuce. Even though I've got low tunnels and cold frames, it's just so much better in the polytunnel. And of course, it's such, you know, lettuce is one of those things, it takes a long time to harvest at the volumes we grow it. And I just don't want to be harvesting it outside in winter and spring, early spring. I will also, though, which is worth noting, start quite a lot of lettuce in November for planting out the end of November or the beginning of December, and that gives me a really nice harvest in spring, and that allows me to get an extra harvest of something else in that period, you know, autumn, in the autumn period. So just squeeze in an extra succession, and I find that that lettuce that I do late on in the year is so much healthier in spring than the stuff that's kind of truly harvested over winter. So lots of varieties of lettuce there. I'll go into details, and then one more succession of lamb's lettuce. Again, this is partly because I just want it all to come on stream in the sort of January, February time period. And if I sow it all earlier, then I get too much early. So another succession of radish, another succession of turnips it's definitely worth building your successions up, particularly of radishes, because the growth rate does start to slow down as we go into September. So you want more and more ready for harvest in September and October and just holding in the ground. Same with turnips, they hold in the ground really well. So you want to get them planted really, sown rather, in August, so that they're mature by the end of September, or early October, and then you just harvest them through until winter. So then we've got more successions, as I say, of salad onions, white Lisbon and Leela. As I said, the earlier ones, I like Guardsman. By the time we get into kind of peak salad onion sowing time, so middle of August sort of time, I don't mind doing white Lisbon and Leela. So I'm also doing Desert Sunrise, which a friend of mine has imported from the US. This is an overwintered early onion, so it starts bulbing on a short day, so when daylight hours reach 14 hours a day, which is the middle of April. So it starts bulbing in the middle of April for a harvest sort of middle of May through June, and definitely before the end of June. I'm quite excited to be trying this because of my disastrous onion harvest this year. So I'm trying to get mature onions, decent size. I don't mind if they're just like 1 inch, maybe 2 inches at harvest time. That's fine, as long as I get them early. That's what I want. More lamb's lettuce, more miner's lettuce, and this last sowing of miner's lettuce is the one that's going in the polytunnel, so that's 30th of August. Takes about 5, maybe even 6 weeks. It's one of the slower growing leafy greens between sowing and planting time. And then more radishes, loads of radishes. Another succession of tough ball. This one will go some in a low tunnel and some in the polytunnel, and maybe a few of them outside. Again, I like doing this with the bulbing onions, having a few outside, a few in a low tunnel and a few in the polytunnel. Just small numbers interplanted into existing beds. And again, it's just like this hedge against freaky weather conditions. Sometimes the ones in the polytunnel, for example, will grow too big. That's fine, we'll just harvest those as spring onions. Sometimes if we have a difficult winter, then they're the ones that we'll leave to grow to maturity. So it all depends on the weather. You can't really predict your dates. It just doesn't, for me. I know Charles Dowding, for example, really loves to try and get one perfect date that works every year for certain of his veggies. I just never understand that. It might make sense for a farmer, but in my situation where I've got low tunnels, cold frames, polytunnels and outside, I've got a choice of different growing environments. It makes sense to have multiple dates so that something always works no matter what the weather conditions, because my weather conditions are not the same every year. So my sowing dates, one sowing date will never be correct every year. It's just too variable. So anyway, September. So this is a rough guide to September. I never sort of finalise my plans until a couple of days before the month starts. But anyway, more salad onions, more radishes. I am pretty much just growing Cherry Belle now. I love it. It is by far the most reliable of the salad onions that I've grown over the last 6 years. It just holds in the ground so well, although sometimes there can be a problem with splitting, but it's pretty rare. It just grows great by comparison with, all the other different varieties that I've tried, which have been much less reliable. I really like it. So next up, I'm starting my Calabrese that'll be sown through September and into early October. And I'll probably do just a few each week, and they will provide a successional harvest next year in kind of April, May and early June. And we like, obviously, that kind of successional harvest. We don't want to harvest them all together because we don't freeze it. And the heads are often small, you know, they come about this sort of size of head and then a flush of side shoots. But it's so welcome through the hungry gap, and it's such a nice complement to the cauliflowers and the purple sprouting broccoli. So next up, about the middle of September, is when I'll sow the lettuces that we'll harvest during winter. And they'll all, as I said, be in the polytunnel. I'm doing Brighton. I let that one heart up. It's the only one really that I let heart up. I'm doing Flashy Butter Oak. I'm doing Roxy. I'm doing Really Red, Deer Tongue, and Grenoble Red. And yeah, they're the only ones basically that I'm going to have over winter. That is quite a restricted range of lettuces for me. I like to grow a lot more varieties than that, but they're the ones that I'm fairly confident in over winter, although I haven't tried Flashy Butter Oak yet, but it's been so good for the rest of the year that I thought I would give it a try. I always let at least one lettuce that I've harvested in spring and summer have a go at winter, and this one is Flashy Butter Oak. To be honest, I don't often succeed in getting another good winter lettuce, but you never succeed unless you try, do you? So then another succession, as I say, every week basically I do a Calabrese batch, only 6 or something like that, and then another batch of Giant Winter. Now the reason that apart from this thing that I don't want to get a glut of spinach in autumn, one of the reasons I do my spinach quite late is because it's going into cold frames after the peppers are finished. And of course the peppers don't finish until well into October. So I have 5 beds of peppers, and I progressively harvest 1 bed a week from about the end of September through to about the end of October. And so I have successions of spinach going in during that time period. What I find with spinach is it does really well in cold frames. Lots of things do better in low tunnels, but spinach just seems to be one of those things that does really nicely in cold frames. So that's generally how I use it. Of course, my peppers are in low tunnels, so I just juggle them around and take the low tunnel tops off and put cold frame tops on instead. And then I'll do a later batch of Brighton. This is the one I'm going to let heart up. And this later batch will go into hanging baskets. And those are the ones we'll harvest to the latest. So probably January, early February sort of time. Because they're going to be the highest up in the polytunnel. So they go the most light, the most warmth, and be furthest away from pests like slugs and things like that. So they're the ones that will be most successful as hearts. More spinach, because there's just lots of repeating things in here. And then towards the end of September, I'll do some field beans. Now, I'm going to do field beans into October as well, but this early sowing, end of September, I'm going to do probably, I haven't 100% decided, but I'm going to try 1 batch in one of my low tunnels or cold frames. And the reason for that is because the broad beans did so well in the polytunnel, they just kept on growing all the way through winter. What I find with the field beans outside is that from about the middle of December until about the early February, they don't really grow very much, so you can't really harvest them very aggressively. You can harvest the spinach during that period, you can harvest the lettuce during that period. I want to harvest the field beans as well, and so I'm going to put them, as I say, under a cold frame or in a low tunnel, because for sure the broad beans grew during that period in the polytunnel. So in theory, so will the field beans, just giving a little bit of extra heat. And we really like to harvest the field bean tips, the growing tips. We use them like a spinach, but because they're lower in oxalic acid, it's a great way of getting a spinach harvest without eating too much oxalic acid through winter. And Also towards the end of September, I'll do my first overwintered cauliflowers. I'm doing Orkney. Hopefully we'll be harvesting those sort of early May time. Now this year we also grew graffiti, started them I think in January. Of course you'll get plenty of notice because in December's video I'll tell you what I'm doing in January. And those were also ready sometime in May. Now we did have particularly great growing conditions, so we don't want to assume that we're going to achieve that this year. So as a hedge, to make sure we do at least have some cauliflowers in that May-June period, we'll overwinter some. We'll do some in end of September and we'll do some in early October. And when I say overwintering the polytunnel, what I mean is we'll just keep them in the pots, in the polytunnel, and plant them out when we get space. And we tend to start getting space in about February time, when growth rates really build, and we don't need as many beds for spinach, we don't need as many beds for lettuce, we don't need as many beds for salad rocket, we don't need as many beds for field beans, all these sorts of things. So all these things we're eating over winter, we'd have a huge glut of them come mid-February and March, and so we're rapidly clearing beds, and we want something to put in those beds. And so these overwintered brassicas are a great thing because they'll still be out of those beds before we start planting the summer crops like the peppers, which will go in sort of late May. So that's the way we do it. It gives us loads of successions all the way through the year, and that's how we manage to eat fresh every day of the year without freezing very much, because we don't have very much freezer space, and what we do have is basically full of summer berries. If you want more details of anything that I've talked about, then the database that I've been looking at down here and you've seen up at the side of the screen, there's a link to that down below in the description. If you want a copy of that database, you can download it, download all the data. You can even download the app that I use and put your own data into it and all that sort of thing. If you're interested in growing any of the things that I talked about, then you'll find links to my individual growing guides, and they cover all the different types of varieties and growing techniques and things like that, as well as how to cover them if you do want to cover them. I don't generally recommend using much fleece over winter for two reasons. One, I find that it doesn't weather very well, and so you get a lot of microplastics dropped into the soil, and it also reduces light levels and increases dampness a lot, and of course that's what you really don't want. I find cold frames are much better. Polythene doesn't drop anywhere near as many microplastics. You get much more light penetration, and of course you can leave the cold frame open and vented so you don't get mold problems. So yeah, all the details of that, as well as winter growing and growing under cover and all those sorts of things, you can find in my ebook, again linked down below. I hope this is useful. My name's Steve, this is the Seaside Kitchen Garden and Allotment channel, and I'll see you soon.